1984 was an incredible year in the history of video games. We saw the establishment of the legendary Famicom. We saw the sad demise of the Atari 5200, the Odyssey, and the Vectrex. We saw some of the most legendary games of all time launch outside of the RPG world, from Tetris, 1942, and Mrs. Pac-Man. I really consider 1984 to be the first modern year in gaming, and that's why I chose this as a good place to start our series. We saw so many innovations of gaming, so many innovations of RPGs that have come to define our genre and come to define our favorite pastime. It's fitting that we start this list off with one of the most important games in history, and that is of course the Black Onyx. Now, many people watching this video won't be familiar with this game or familiar with the series name in general. This game only released in Japan and only for the PC. Later it was released for the Famicom and for the Game Boy as well. But this game originally did launch, and it can be credited for really establishing the turn-based combat system in Japanese games, really popularizing RPGs in Japanese culture. Up until this point, yes, there were other turn-based games, yes, there were other RPGs, but no game really set the Japanese culture alight, I guess, if you want to put it that way. This game was able to sell 150,000 copies, and while that may not seem like much today, that was an incredible accomplishment back then. There were so few people playing games back then that 150,000 copies is like 3 or 4 million today. Now, turn-based combat in RPGs can be seen in so many influential games from the past 20-30 years. Games like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy IX, Persona 5, and my personal favorite, Lunar the Silver Star Story. I think it's safe to say that JRPGs and RPGs in general would probably not look the same today if it wasn't for the unbelievable game, the Black Onyx. Second game on the list is another Japanese-only PC game in 1984. Man, the Japanese really killed it back then on the PC, creating some amazing experiences. It's a recurring theme that you'll see with a lot of these games releasing on the PC first, just because consoles at the time really weren't capable of supporting games like this. However, many of these did get ports later to the Famicom. But this game is so revolutionary, not that it was the first game, but that it was one of the first games, and one of the probably first popular games especially, that really brought these aspects to widestream attention. And this game really revolutionized being one of the first games to have an in-game map. This is a feature that seems so simple and so common, but nobody had really done this before in a popular game. So this showed people what could be done. And could you imagine a game today without a map? Another thing that seems like such a small thing, but was a major thing at the time, was an in-game inventory. Pretty much every RPG nowadays has an in-game inventory, from Fallout to Oblivion to even a Final Fantasy game, but this was one of the first games to actually do that. And much like the Black Onyx, this game was later released to the Game Boy and to the Sega Saturn, but unfortunately it never came to North America. And as important as the first two games were, I would say the Tower of Druaga is probably the most important game, most important RPG that launched in 1984. I'll say probably Pac-Man and Tetris are probably more important, but as far as RPGs go, this takes the cake. This game, I think more than any other game, really got people into RPGs. It looks so much like Pac-Man. Obviously it is a maze-based game and an action RPG, so this opened up the genre. It got people who otherwise wouldn't have given these games a shot. You know, RPGs always tend to be a little bit more of a niche genre, but this game really helped open it up to other people. This game is held as an inspiration, held as really the footing for many of the most popular RPGs of all time. Games like The Legend of Zelda, Dragon Slayer even, the YS series, and many, many more all take direct influence from the Tower of Druaga. Sadly, this is one of the only RPGs from this year that actually has a continuance to this day. We see reboots coming up all the time, re-releases to Steam or other various platforms. I think a DS version was actually the most recent one. And we even saw an anime for this in 2008. Now, I haven't checked it out. I'm not sure if it's any good or not, but that's pretty cool. And it's good to see that at least one of these games still is remembered in the general media. Now, one of the only great Western RPGs at this time frame, or this time period, was The Ancient Art of War by Dave Murray and Barry Murray. It's unbelievable to think that only a couple of people were able to make such an amazing game. And some people will say, you know, this isn't a true RPG. And, you know, I guess I can see where they're coming from. But this game, in my opinion, while it's clearly not a Final Fantasy, it's clearly not a Skyrim, I think this game is a clear predecessor for games like Final Fantasy Tactics, games like even Disgaea 5, the tactical RPGs. This game was so revolutionary. It's so hard to put into words the way these games changed, the way we view games. Things that we take for granted today. Like I said, like maps. The way this game actually had different characters with different abilities on a large scale, where you're actually placing formations and strategizing on how you're actually gonna attack this opponent with this specific character. Each character has weaknesses, each character has strengths. That was something that was so unique at the time frame, guys. It sounds like such a small thing today, but I think most modern games at least owe some gratitude to games like this that came before. One of the last RPGs that was released in 1984 was Hylide. I'm gonna pronounce it as that. I'm sure it's some other way. But an amazing game. One of the only games that actually made it over to North American consoles. It came out for the NES in 1989, a full 5 years after Japan got it. And again, that shows to how far back consoles were to PCs at the time. They just couldn't handle this type of game. Not for a few years anyway. Now, this game is a revolutionary game. I think right off the bat, the first thing you'll see is that this game looks so much like The Legend of Zelda. And it's pretty obvious to me, and pretty obvious to I think anybody who sees this, that The Legend of Zelda and games that came after this definitely took some direct inspiration. Not only from its graphical style, but one of its most unique features was that it was one of the first games to popularize life regeneration. Up until this point, that was again something that people didn't see in video games, and I keep repeating myself, but it sounds like it's something that people take for granted, but things like that didn't exist before this game. And I'm not sure if you could have RPGs. I'm not sure if you could have a game like Skyrim, a game like Oblivion, Fallout, where your health didn't regenerate. I'm not sure if that would be possible. And I definitely think modern games definitely owe a lot to this game. If you asked many people what was the game of the year of 1984, a lot of people will say Tetris, some Mrs. Pac-Man, maybe even Dragon Slayer, but the game that actually won Game of the Year for 1984 was none other than Night Lore. This game was, again, incredibly revolutionary, one of the first games to take a 3D perspective on things, and it's hard to put enough emphasis on just how important that was in video game history. It really revolutionized games. And while, I don't think this game was the best game, it did receive an incredible score of 95%. It's hard to argue with that. I think a lot of people were definitely blown away by the graphic style that it chose. Stay tuned, guys. I'm glad you stayed through the whole video. Stay tuned next week and see what RPGs came out in the year of 1985. Suggest some games that you guys think should make the list. Suggest some topics of games that you think I left off of 1984. There really were some great games. I just had to narrow it down to a few of them.